You didn't just grow up controlled. You were programmed. Narcissistic mothers invade, disguising need as nurture, jealousy as love. Narcissistic fathers erase, disguising silence as strength, control as protection. They didn't raise you. They rewired you to serve their image, meet their needs, obey their version of you. If you felt guilt for having a boundary, if love meant abandoning yourself, if your truth made you the enemy, that wasn't parenting. That was psychological warfare. They broke you differently, but the outcome was the same. You became easier to control. This video is the insight they never wanted you to have. If you grew up questioning your own memories, if one parent tried to erase you while the other tried to own you, this video is for you. It won't be easy, but we're going to break down how narcissistic parents fracture their sons and daughters differently, and why surviving them made you see the world the way you do now. He didn't raise a son. He sculpted a shadow of himself. Not to see you thrive, but to see himself reflected back, without contradiction, without softness, without truth. Narcissistic fathers don't nurture. They condition. They raise sons like soldiers, disposable extensions of legacy, tools, not individuals. From a young age, the rules are made clear. Emotions are weakness. Vulnerability is shameful. Independence is disobedience. The son who mirrors his father's image gets praise. The son who questions it is punished. If you weren't like him, you were wrong. If you tried to be yourself, you were dangerous. And if you didn't perform, you were invisible. He withheld approval like oxygen. Not to teach you strength, but to train your nervous system to equate love with pressure. Psychologist Terence Real calls this the psychological patriarchy, where men are emotionally exiled at a young age, cut off from vulnerability to maintain control and dominance. This isn't just emotional neglect, it's identity theft. You were programmed not to feel, because if you did, you'd challenge the architecture of his ego. Many sons of narcissistic fathers display signs of alexithymia, the inability to name or recognize one's emotions, not because they lack emotion, but because those emotions were framed as threats. You learned to suppress yourself not out of weakness, but as an act of self-preservation. This is how sons become fractured. You were taught to be strong before you were ever allowed to be whole. You became hyper-responsible, emotionally mute, and physically present, but psychically absent. Not out of choice, out of survival. Because his silence was never peaceful. It was weaponized, a performance of power that made you question your worth in every quiet room. He didn't explode, not always. He eroded, with subtle comparisons, with unmet glances, with that ever-present, you'll never be enough tension. He called it discipline, but it was domination. Michel Foucault's theory of disciplinary power is at play here. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet conditioning that molds behavior through shame and surveillance. You weren't raised, you were regulated. And now you overperform, you underfeel, you distrust your softness, punish your uncertainty, and mistake isolation for integrity. You inherited a mask, not a model. And that mask fits just tight enough to suffocate, but loose enough to slip in moments of intimacy. You were never allowed to be, only to become him, or be broken. But now, you realize the rage wasn't yours. It was what you inherited just to survive his presence. Your anger wasn't rebellion. It was the armor you built just to stay visible in his world. Let's take a moment to reflect. What emotion did you bury to earn his respect? Was it sadness, fear, wonder, compassion? When did silence feel safer than truth? What moment taught you that your voice was a liability, not a right? Who would you be if you weren't trying to be enough for him? Not better than him, not worthy of him, just free from his narrative. But here's the part most sons never say out loud. It wasn't just the things he did. It was the things he never gave. The safety to feel, the permission to stray, the grace to be seen without proving yourself. And while the father often dominated with silence and pressure, the narcissistic mother wields something just as corrosive: closeness that confuses, love that consumes, control disguised as care. Let's talk about the other side of the war, where nurturing becomes a weapon and daughters learn to betray themselves in the name of loyalty. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a mirror, but not one that reflected truth. A mirror that flattered, obeyed, absorbed, and never outshone. The narcissistic mother is a master of emotional fusion. She doesn't raise a daughter, she consumes her. And it starts with the illusion of closeness. She wraps herself in sacrifice. I gave you everything. But what she gave was conditional, and what she took was foundational. Your voice, your freedom, your ability to exist without guilt. This is textbook emotional enmeshment, where the mother's unmet needs are projected onto the daughter, who is expected to regulate her mother's emotions, often at the cost of her own. Clinical psychology calls this parentification, where a child becomes the emotional caretaker of the adult. And if you failed to meet her needs, she made you the problem. Her jealousy didn't always look like envy. Sometimes it looked like sabotage disguised as advice. Don't dress like that. You're not ready. No one will ever love you like I do. Every warning was a leash. She took up the space of a victim and made you feel guilty for even existing inside it. Feminist psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin explains how mothers can invert the mutual recognition needed in healthy relationships. Instead of seeing you as separate, she saw you as subject to her, never sovereign. Her wounds were sacred. Yours were shameful. Her emotions were gospel. Yours were dramatic. She could erupt in rage, but your tears were too much. Her suffering took center stage, but your joy felt like betrayal. And when she couldn't control you through pity, she switched to punishment. Withdrawal, guilt trips, smear campaigns. The moment you showed autonomy, she rewrote the narrative. You were ungrateful, selfish, just like your father. This isn't maternal love. This is psychological cannibalism dressed as care. Over time, this dynamic creates internalized guilt loops, where the daughter feels responsible for the mother's unhappiness and suppresses her own needs to preserve the illusion of maternal harmony. This results in fawning, emotional self-erasure, and a fractured self-concept. Because in her eyes, your independence was treason, and her version of love only worked if you stayed small enough to manage. For many daughters, the deepest betrayal wasn't what she did in anger. It was what she demanded in the name of love, and what you had to give up just to be good. But now, you realize her love was conditional on compliance, and your individuality was the thing she tried hardest to erase. Let's pause here for a moment. When did love start to feel like a performance, measured by how well you played her version of you? What truths did you bury to protect her story of herself? If you weren't trying to win her love, who would you have become? Without guilt, without shrinking, without needing her approval. But here's what they never warned you about. Just because the parent matched your gender didn't mean the other one wasn't shaping you too. Narcissistic fathers weaponize silence against daughters. Narcissistic mothers perform victimhood to guilt their sons. Different genders, same manipulation. But when control comes dressed in affection, it gets harder to name and nearly impossible to escape. Let's look at how narcissistic parents distort their children across gender lines, and why some wounds only make sense once you trace who taught you to normalize them. They said they were just close, but closeness without boundaries isn't connection, it's captivity. Because when narcissistic parents can't dominate through fear, they manipulate through favoritism, especially when the child is the opposite gender. Narcissistic fathers often crown daughters as emotional surrogates, masking their dysfunction as affection. You weren't his daughter, you were his confidant, his mirror, his reason to feel powerful. It felt like connection, but it was covert control. It's when the father bypasses his partner and pulls his daughter into the role of comforter, cheerleader, and protector. He praises her constantly, but only when she stays small, sweet, and loyal. The moment she asserts autonomy, she becomes ungrateful, cold, or worst of all, just like your mother. This creates internal chaos, because how do you rebel against someone who never raised their voice, but always raised your responsibility? You were emotionally captured, but praised for being mature for your age. That wasn't maturity. It was trauma-aged obedience. This dynamic often leads to relational trauma, disordered attachment, and disrupted sexual boundaries. Daughters raised as pseudo-partners often struggle to discern emotional safety from obligation and self-worth from sacrifice. On the flip side, narcissistic mothers disarm sons through a different tactic: emasculation disguised as care. She doesn't raise him. She binds him, smothers him with guilt trips, infantilizes him with over-involvement, makes his loyalty the measure of his love, and his independence the proof of betrayal. His role, caretaker of her wounds, guardian of her narrative. The son isn't allowed to be a man, because that would mean separating. So she keeps him small, soft, confused, rewarding weakness if it keeps him near. If he dates someone with boundaries, she's taking you from me. If he pulls away to think for himself, you've changed. If he speaks up, how could you talk to your own mother like that? It's control through collapse, using helplessness as the leash. A learned weapon, what psychologists call covert emotional dependency, where the parent disables autonomy through self-victimization. Over time, it rewires his belief system. And it teaches him this: strength makes women suffer. So stay weak, stay close. Because in her world, You're only lovable when you're manageable. Existential psychotherapist Rollo May warned of false intimacy, where proximity replaces authenticity. These dynamics don't nurture connection. They manufacture fusion, which looks like closeness, but feels like erasure. Whether it's the daughter propping up a broken father, or the son buffering the wounded mother, the result is the same. You become a surrogate partner, responsible for their regulation, trapped in a bond where leaving feels like cruelty, and staying feels like self-erasure. You learn that love equals regulation, not recognition, and walking away doesn't feel like growth. It feels like abandoning the person who trained you to forget yourself. But there comes a moment you realize you were protecting them more than they ever protected you. Before we go deeper, take a moment with me. What role were you forced to play in their emotional life? Was it therapist, savior, protector? When did their love become your burden? What part of your innocence did they make about them? They didn't just blur boundaries, they rewrote your understanding of connection. And the hardest part? You normalized it. You learned to shrink for safety, to merge for love, to abandon your needs for their comfort. And long after they stop pulling the strings, the conditioning continues in you. Let's look at how their control became your inner critic and why the damage they caused still echoes in your self-worth long after they left the room. They didn't just control your behavior, they rewrote your reality. Because the most effective form of domination isn't physical, it's psychic. It's when someone rearranges your internal world so precisely, you begin to monitor yourself on their behalf. Narcissistic parenting installs a system, not just rules but reflexes. You start scanning every room, not for threat, but for approval. You fawn before you even realize you're afraid. You shrink just enough to stay acceptable. Because staying too much meant punishment, withdrawal, or shame. This is relational trauma, also known as fawning trauma response, a nervous system strategy to preserve attachment by suppressing authenticity. It becomes so ingrained, you lose access to your original signal. You don't know what you want, only what's safe. You learn that peace comes at the cost of your authenticity and start offering it up like currency. Enmeshment doesn't just blur boundaries, it dismantles identity. If you were parented by someone who rewarded compliance and punished autonomy, you may now confuse self-sacrifice with love and people-pleasing with connection. You check the temperature of every relationship before revealing a single need. You keep one foot out of intimacy because full presence never felt safe. If your autonomy was met with anger, guilt, or rejection, you likely learned that self-erasure equals love. You don't ask, you anticipate, you don't take up space, you accommodate, you don't speak your truth, you translate it into what won't get punished. You over-explain, over-apologize, over-function, because under-functioning was never an option. This isn't weakness, this is trauma adaptation. It's neural survival conditioning. Your nervous system is still expecting them to walk in the room. You weren't allowed to just be. So you became who they needed at the expense of who you are. Now you can't tell the difference between your instinct and your programming, because for too long, the only way to feel wanted was to disappear. And if your narcissistic parent ruled through dominance instead of enmeshment, you didn't disappear. You overperformed to prove your worth, to dodge their contempt, to avoid the cold stare that said, "Not enough." You became the responsible one, the achiever, the emotional adult in the room. But it wasn't maturity, it was survival, masquerading as excellence. You chased perfection not because you believed in yourself, but because anything less would have been used against you. Now you confuse stress with success. You equate attention with affection. You believe calm is dangerous because calm was never predictable. Something always exploded once you let your guard down. This is how gendered narcissistic trauma plays out in the nervous system, in your relationships, in your identity. A daughter learns to self-abandon in the name of harmony. A son learns to self-silence in the name of strength. And beneath it all is a shame loop, not learned, but inherited. Nietzsche once wrote, "They muddy the water to make it seem deep." Your narcissistic parent didn't just muddy your emotional world, they taught you to call confusion wisdom, to call exhaustion love, to call self-erasure character. Because when love came with conditions, you started believing your truth was too much to be loved. And when guilt was used to keep you small, you made yourself smaller just to survive. But that guilt, that shame, that anxious hypervigilance, it's not the real you. It's the echo of someone else's brokenness, trapped inside your nervous system. Ask yourself this: how did their brokenness become your baseline? What traits in you trace directly back to their wounds? What does love feel like to you, and does it feel safe? When was the last time you felt connected without compromise? Who are you beneath the guilt that isn't even yours? If guilt was removed, who would emerge in its place? This isn't just trauma, it's internal colonization, where your thoughts echo their judgments, where your emotions betray your truth, where your identity was edited by someone else's fear. But here's what they never wanted you to realize. None of it was ever about you. You weren't too emotional. You weren't ungrateful. You weren't broken. You were responding to a system designed to keep you small. Let's break that illusion, starting now. They didn't see you. They scanned you for signs of disobedience, for slivers of autonomy, for anything that might crack the illusion they needed to uphold. You weren't nurtured. You were used. Not as a child, but as a projection screen. Narcissistic parents don't respond to who their child is. They respond to what their child represents. And when your presence threatened their denial, they rewrote your identity to defend their comfort, not consciously, but systematically. This is called projective identification, a defense mechanism where the narcissist projects intolerable aspects of themselves onto you, and then shapes your behavior to fulfill that distorted image. You stop being seen. You start being used to regulate their self-image. You weren't too sensitive. You were perceptive, and that threatened their denial. You weren't disobedient. You were individuating, and that offended their control. You weren't a disappointment. You just refused to perform, and that exposed their emptiness. But as a child, you didn't have the philosophical frame or emotional language, so you filled the gap with self-blame. If they're angry, I must have failed. If they're cold, I must be unlovable. If they're disappointed, I must be broken. That wasn't your truth. It was internalized projection. Their dysfunction became your defect. Their unmetabolized shame became your operating system, and you wore it like it was yours, quietly, constantly. But here's the real betrayal. You became the evidence they used to deny their own brokenness. Your boundaries became disrespect. Your intuition became rebellion. Your authenticity became a threat, not because it was, but because it revealed them. Carl Jung warned, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." But a narcissistic parent doesn't just burden you with their unlived life, they erase yours to make room for it. They made your existence feel like an error, not because you were wrong, but because you were a mirror they couldn't manipulate. Your joy highlighted their emptiness. Your light disrupted their script. Your growth made their stagnation undeniable. And instead of evolving, they punished you for existing beyond their frame. Because narcissistic parents don't raise children, they cast characters, they assign roles, and they get violent, emotionally or psychologically, when the actor deviates from the script. You weren't the problem. You were the evidence, and they needed that evidence to disappear. So they gaslit your memory, minimized your wounds, shamed your emotions, and taught you to apologize for every instinct that didn't serve their image. This is not just emotional abuse. This is epistemic abuse, a distortion of your reality to protect their authority. It attacks your ability to know what you know and replaces it with a version of truth that serves them. Your clarity deserves reflection. Start here. When did you start believing their behavior meant something was wrong with you? Was there a moment your truth got rewritten, subtly, consistently, until you silenced it? What did they see in you that they couldn't tolerate? Was it your empathy, your clarity, your refusal to collapse? What clarity have you gained now that makes their version of reality feel absurd? And how does it feel to finally trust it? They didn't raise you. They rewrote you to protect a narrative that couldn't survive the light of your awareness. But now you see through it. You've pulled back the frame. You've stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "Why did they need me to believe that?" And that question, that's the beginning of reconstruction. Let's talk about how you rebuild a self you were never allowed to be. Not for them, not for survival, but for you, for sovereignty, for truth. Let's move into structure. Let's talk boundaries, truth, and finally, becoming your own anchor. The most violent illusion you were raised with was the belief that one day they'd change, that love would finally feel safe, that clarity would finally be welcomed, that if you just tried hard enough, you'd earn what was never yours to carry in the first place. But healing doesn't begin with comfort, it begins with grief. Because individuation, the psychological process of becoming your true self, demands a funeral. Not for them, but for the self you constructed to keep their approval. The performance that passed for personality. The silence that passed for safety. Jung wrote, "Individuation begins the moment you reject the lie. Not just the lie they told about who you were, but the lie that they were ever equipped to love you unconditionally." You have to bury the fantasy that one day they'll be soft, that one day you'll be enough, that one day they'll hold your truth without turning it against you. Because repair requires two things narcissistic parents cannot offer: accountability and empathy. And waiting for that, it's not loyalty, it's self-abandonment in disguise. Sovereignty begins with this rupture. You do not owe your perception to those who profit from distorting it. You don't need to defend your boundary. You need to enforce it. You were raised to over-explain, to soften your truth, to audit your tone before they could weaponize your words. That wasn't diplomacy. That was hypervigilance, mistaken for maturity. But now, your boundaries don't seek agreement. They demand distance. Gabor Mate's trauma theory teaches the child would rather be the bad self than lose the attachment. But now you're not the child. You're the witness, and the witness does not apologize for clarity. You don't owe them peace. You owe yourself presence. You don't owe them understanding. You owe yourself unlearning. You don't owe them loyalty to your pain. You owe yourself liberation from their version of you. This is the reconstruction, not of what they expected, but of the self they never let you become. You no longer apologize when you say no. You no longer contort yourself to keep the table set. You no longer betray your body to preserve their illusion. Because what they called too much was your truth before it was conditioned, and the moment you stopped shrinking to fit their emotional poverty, you stopped being their mirror and started becoming your own anchor. Bell Hooks wrote, "Love and abuse cannot coexist." What you experienced wasn't love. It was dependency enforced through distortion. And your clarity was never the problem. It was the threat. Now answer this, honestly. What would your life look like if you stopped negotiating your truth? What parts of you are waiting for permission to re-emerge? What boundary are you scared to set, but know you must? Not because it's cruel, but because it's the only form of self-trust you've never practiced. Who would you be if you weren't scared of being misunderstood? What version of you has been waiting for the noise to die down? Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." You were called chaos. Now you get to become the star. You don't need their apology. You don't need their validation. You don't even need closure from them. Because what they broke in you, you now rebuild in your image. Stronger, clearer, freer. And what they never counted on was that your survival would become your vision. Your clarity would become your compass. Your healing would become the very thing that undoes their legacy. Let's close the loop. Let's talk about the one thing they never wanted you to find. The gift buried in the wound. You didn't just survive something hard. You survived something calculated, engineered, disguised as love. Because narcissistic parents don't just injure by accident. They injure by design. Not always consciously, but with a precision born from their own denied fractures. They target authenticity. Because authenticity threatens illusion, your presence interrupted their performance, so they punished you for existing without distortion. They didn't just lie about who they were, they lied about who you were allowed to be, what you could feel, what parts of you were safe to bring into a room. And when your light clashed with their shadow, you were framed as the problem. So you adapted. You minimized truth. You erased softness. You disowned intuition, not to be loved, but to survive the conditionality of love. But here's what they never expected: that their control would birth the one thing they couldn't manage. Discernment. Post-traumatic insight isn't delusion. It's clarity sharpened by survival. You now see the shape of manipulation the second it enters the room. You hear control in someone's silence. You feel betrayal before it's named. This is your gift, born in exile, refined in fire, and carried forward by a nervous system that now refuses to play dead. Jung said, individuation begins the moment you reject the lie, and you've rejected them all. The lie that you were too much, the lie that boundaries are cruelty, the lie that love must feel like abandonment. Those weren't truths, they were cages, and you didn't fight your way out. You outgrew them. What they shattered became the shape of your knowing. What they silenced became the voice that won't disappear. They didn't raise a child, they tried to raise a mirror. But mirrors reflect, witnesses remember. And you remember everything. You remember what joy felt like before guilt. You remember what softness was before suppression. You remember who you were before they told you it was too much to be loved. This isn't a wound, it's a blueprint. You no longer chase peace that demands self-erasure. You no longer perform for tables where your silence is the entry fee. Kintsugi teaches that the crack is where the gold goes. And now, you shine because of the rupture. They handed you shame. You transmuted it into sovereignty. They buried you in silence. You resurrected in truth. This isn't just healing. It's metamorphosis. You don't owe your past a performance. You owe your future a presence. Your clarity is your compass. Your sovereignty is your shield. Your story? It isn't just survival. It's design. It's discernment. It's destiny. Let's pause here to reflect. One last time. What truth do you now see too clearly to ever unsee? What did you normalize that you now name as abuse? What version of yourself is ready to return? Not as a reaction, but as reclamation. What does survival look like when it's yours, not theirs? What does it mean to exist without being edited? Viktor Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." You changed, you remembered, and that remembering, that's not weakness, that's resistance, that's return, that's rise. If you finally understand it was never about you, write in the comments below. I see it now. Your story matters, and you're not alone. You didn't imagine it. You endured it. And now, you rise from it.